You do the crime and you do the time. That's how the saying goes, isn't it? I ask because nowadays I feel more and more that the saying should be amended to, you do the crime, but don't worry about it. That was reinforced for me this week when the prison minister, Rory Stewart, announced that he's considering banning sentences of less than 6 months. Mr. Stewart feels such sentences are long enough to damage criminals, but not long enough to heal them. What? He argues that in such cases, community sentences are more effective in both rehabilitation and to reduce reoffending. He also hopes by implementing this plan, he will reduce strain on our stretched prison services. Mr. Stewart, I've got some news for you. If your prison services are stretched, fund them properly. And whilst I'm indeed a fan of rehabilitation, it should surely only go hand in hand with punishment too.
Well, surprisingly, I won't agree with you. I remember making a programme, I've been to a lot of prisons. I remember making a programme about prisons 30, 40 years ago, and they said if the prison population gets to 40,000, we're going to be in crisis. Well, it's now 85,000. We're sending more and more and more people to prison. And at some stage, and Rory Stewart, who I think is a prison minister, is quite a brave man, who says, if I can't solve lots of these things in a year, I'll give up the job. I think it's an interesting thing that he's doing. What he might do better is that they've already done it in Scotland, and it might be interesting to see what the results are in Scotland. But I think the evidence is pretty clear that if you send people to prison for the first time, it's an enormous shock, but in the end they become institutionalised and they become part of it. And if you can stop that and use community services instead, I think that's quite a good idea. But the other big thing is every person we send to prison costs us £30,000. Someone on a community service costs £5. Mm-hmm. And I think we've become obsessed about sending people to prison. I think politicians, and that's why I admire Mr. Stewart, politicians historically, particularly Labour politicians, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, meant that we just carried on sending people to prison when we didn't see any evidence that it would have any impact.
Nick just laughed then.
Can I...
I was just going to say, Greg, what's the role of prison? Is it protection, rehabilitation or punishment?
Well, everyone would say it's a bit of each, but actually...
Where's the punishment if they don't even go to jail?
Well, these are people on quite low sentences. Yeah. And what they're saying is, if it's quite a low sentence, well, let's try rehabilitation.
OK, but listen, with every crime there is a victim. So even if it's not a violent crime, even if it's a burglary or a car theft or someone gives you a little bit of a smack in the street, OK, the victim has to know that we have a criminal justice system that cares more about them than the people who try to wreck their lives. And Rory Stewart, who I actually like and admire, actually, he talks about this 6-month sentencing like it's a form of counselling, like some form of therapy, not a punishment. People need to know that the people who hurt them are going to be punished. And the community sentencing, I would totally agree with. If it worked, it doesn't work. Judges and magistrates have entirely... No, they don't work. They've entirely lost faith in them.
Yeah, just say, first of all, to clarify, this proposed reform doesn't include violent offences nor sexual offences. No. And it's only for offences that are less than 12 months. So things like, pickpocketing or stealing from a store. And usually what happens when you take a 17, 16, 14-year-old, even for juvenile offences, if you put them in prison for the first time, Greg's point kicks in. They learn from hardened criminals, they learn how to be better at crime. They become brutalised. They could end up joining gangs. Many of them do. And the evidence indicates that they come out and reoffend. And so it isn't the best way to protect the victim.
But Magic, community
because they're coming
service,
out they're coming out to commit more and more crime.
Do you know, 35%... Let me just say this fact. 35% of the people who go to prison have been given at least 5 community service orders and set before they go.
So the problem in Scotland is that they are trying this in Scotland, but the community service option for sentences less than 12 years is currently optional for the criminal, not mandatory. I think it should be mandatory. They can't choose a fine or community service. Currently in Scotland, they're choosing a fine, which they only have to pay back, incrementally over months, and if they don't pay that back, eventually they could be sent to jail. It strikes me as a bit of a thing. But the experts, like the Howard League, who look at prison reform, have said this. Let's have a look at this.
Short sentences are damaging. They're damaging to the individual concerned because they don't help them sort out their lives. They're damaging to the taxpayer because it costs a fortune. They're damaging to victims because most people who come out of prison, particularly on short sentences, go straight out and commit another crime. They really do no good at all.
In particular, young teenage boys who've committed a first offence and it's less than 12 months and it's not violent and it's not sexual. I think, you know, the kind of society I want is to see is where they are punished through mandatory community service, which reduces the chances of them re-offending as well.
Can we just get some figures in? Because it obviously gives the viewer a perspective. So, these are figures from the Ministry of Justice, October of last year. There are around 80,000 people imprisoned in England and Wales, Greg, as you rightly said. In 2017, 47% of offenders were given sentences of 6 months or less. The reoffending rate is 64.5% for adults given custodial sentences of less than 12 months. The reoffending rate is 38.2% for adults given non-custodial sentences. If you take advice from people like Bill Bratton, who was a supremely successful police chief in both Los Angeles, Boston and New York, he goes by the broken window policy, which is if you... So the young child, the teenager who's suddenly a shoplifter, if he doesn't... The other way of looking at it, if he gets away with a bit of shoplifting, then he moves up the scale, and the broken window theory says you get them as soon as you can.
As I've been very open about before, when I was a teenage girl, my boyfriend was in and out of prison like a yo-yo. That was my Saturday weekends, was going into Hull prison to visit him. And he loved being in prison.
Why?
His mates was there, he had a free gym, he got all of his food cooked, he got to watch whatever, like DVDs or whatever it was that they had in those days. And sometimes when I think back to him, I often think, actually, in their scenario, there was an argument for prisons being tougher, so that when he got sent to prison on that first time, it wasn't like a holiday camp.
You said in your introduction we should spend more money on prisons and therefore have bigger prisons than the rest. You try being the prison minister and getting more money out of the Treasury for prisoners. I mean, my wife was a probation officer in Wandsworth, and it was very... So I've been in quite a lot of prisons, and it's very hard to see
don't you think
there is much benefit. So therefore, I think most of it, coming back to your point earlier, most of prisons is about, you know, there are some very dangerous people we need to keep away from society.
Protection.
Look, it is making prisons tougher. We've got to, when we say this, we've got to understand that currently, like, the suicide rate in prisons is through the roof. The gang crime problems it's genuinely scary with the gang affiliations, the drug problems. Prison isn't working. It hasn't worked in the United States. This zero tolerance policy leads to people stealing a slice of pizza, going down for life, and crazy stuff like that in America.
Why do people keep going back by choice?
Well, no, that's the thing is that's because they become institutionalised. I wonder how your ex-boyfriend is faring now, by the way, because once you take a teenager into prison,
well, he ain't got me in his life, has he?
Heartbroken.
I know, but he'd probably be a good father. Well, that's almost it.
See what I have to put up with?
That's almost it. But before we go, there's just time for this. Nobody can escape the B word this week, you know, to the state of being bored. As Brexit drama reaches a fever pitch. It's in the news, it's on every front page, it's even taken over the pledge. Whilst everyone has an opinion on it, not everybody has strong and stable ideas on what should be done. Until now. Attorney General Geoffrey Cox stood up in Parliament to make a last-ditch attempt to get MPs to vote for the Prime Minister's deal. This is what happened next.
What are you playing at? What are you doing? You are not children in the playground. You are legislators. And it is your job. In a minute, I promise the Right Honourable Lady, I will give way. I intend to take many interventions in the course of this speech. We are playing with people's lives.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, Mr. Cox's attempt proved to be useless as Theresa May's deal was voted down in a historic defeat. But at least he broke through the Brexit waffle for almost a minute. And that's why, Geoffrey Cox, you win our straight talker.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And that's it for this week. You can join in the debate online. Just search for The Pledge on Facebook or Twitter. And thanks for watching.
Straight talking